My name is Eric, and I've been a forest ranger for nearly 15 years. Born and raised in the heart of these wild lands, the forests and mountains are my home. The trees, the silence, the animals, they all speak a language that's deeply ingrained in me. But there's one place I wish I had never set foot in: the Smoky Mountains National Park. The day I decided to go there, I didn't know it would change me forever. It was the kind of decision I'd never thought I'd regret, but looking back, I know it was the beginning of the end. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone in the ranger community knew the legends surrounding the park. Strange happenings, missing persons, and more whispers than I could count. But I was a professional. I believed the stories were just that, stories. Nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself. I was sent to investigate a supposed disturbance in the park. A few rangers had gone missing over the past few months, and there were murmurs of something sinister taking root in the thick woods. Something ancient, something vengeful. My commanding officer, a man with years of experience, insisted it was nothing to worry about, but the unease in his voice was impossible to ignore. At first, I thought the mission would be like any other. I packed my gear and headed for the Smoky Mountains, expecting a few days of routine patrol and nothing more. I couldn't have been more wrong. When I arrived, the atmosphere was different from anything I'd ever encountered. The trees were taller than I remembered, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, as if they were reaching for something or someone. The air was thick, like something pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The sounds of the forest were muffled, distant, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't long before I noticed the signs. The ground was disturbed, trampled as if something large and heavy had passed through. Animal tracks, all leading deeper into the forest. But the thing that made my skin crawl was the absence of birds. There was no song, no chirping, no rustling in the trees. It was as if all life had abandoned this place. I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest, and eventually came upon something that made my stomach churn. A ranger's badge, bloodied and torn, half buried under a pile of leaves. I knew instantly what it meant. One of my own had been taken. I shouldn't have gone any further, but I couldn't stop. Some dark force was pulling me in. The deeper I went, the more I felt it. Eyes watching me from the shadows, a presence I couldn't explain. I wasn't alone, and I realized that far too late. That's when I saw it. A figure, half human, half shadow, standing in the clearing. Its eyes glowed red, a fiery, vengeful light that seemed to burn through my very soul. It wasn't a creature of flesh and bone. It was something ancient, something wrong. A being of the forest, twisted by centuries of neglect and anger, forgotten by time, but not by the land. It spoke to me, its voice like the crackle of burning wood. It told me I had come too far, that I had trespassed into a realm that no human should ever know. It told me it would take my soul, just as it had taken the others. But there was something in its words, something I didn't understand at first. It wasn't just anger, it was vengeance. It had been waiting for someone like me, a forest ranger, one of the caretakers of the land, the very ones who should have known better. I tried to run. I don't know why I thought I could outrun it. My legs felt like lead, and no matter how fast I moved, the forest seemed to close in around me, trapping me. I heard the crunch of branches behind me, the whispers in the wind. The figure was always there, just out of sight, following me, never letting me escape. I thought I was going to die that day, but I didn't. Somehow, I made it out of the Smoky Mountains. Barely. My body was broken, my mind shattered. I couldn't explain what happened. It was too much, too unreal. But I knew one thing for certain. The forest had claimed me, and I would never be the same. Now, I hear the whispers in my sleep. I feel the presence watching me when I'm out in the woods. The forest's vengeance has become a part of me, a dark shadow that follows wherever I go. And I know it's not over. It never will be. So let this be a warning to anyone thinking of going to the Smoky Mountains National Park. Don't listen to the rumors. Don't think it's just a myth. The forest is alive, and it's waiting. If you go there, if you trespass too far, it will find you, and it will never let you leave. I can't undo what's been done, but you can. Stay away. The Smoky Mountains National Park is one of the most renowned national parks in the United States, stretching across both North Carolina and Tennessee. Known for its lush greenery, mist-shrouded peaks, and an array of flora and fauna, it is a place that beckons adventurers, hikers, and nature enthusiasts. However, not all that seems serene and beautiful is as peaceful as it appears, and there are hidden corners of the park that hold secrets few dare to uncover. As a forest ranger with 20 years of experience, I thought I knew these lands better than most. I thought I could handle whatever came my way. but nothing could have prepared me for the ancient, vengeful spirit that waits in the shadows of the Smoky Mountains. Before my ill-fated trip, I was a ranger who had learned to respect the land, not just as a duty, but as a deep part of my soul. The forest was not merely trees and wildlife. It was a living, breathing entity, something I felt connected to in ways that defied words. I had spent countless days trekking through thick woods, knowing the land, the animals, and even the most remote parts of the park. I could identify a twig broken by a bear's heavy paws or a trail left behind by a fox. But none of that mattered when I stepped into that darkened part of the Smoky Mountains, a place no ranger had ever dared to venture alone. The area I was assigned to wasn't far from some of the more well-known sites in the park, but it was less frequently visited. In hindsight, that should have been my first clue. There were whispers among fellow rangers about the place, murmurs of strange happenings that no one had dared to confirm, but which were enough to create an air of unease whenever the subject came up. Veteran rangers had seen something, felt something, but they never stayed long enough to talk about it. Even my own mentor, who had spent decades patrolling the park, had a distant look in his eyes when the Smoky Mountains came up in conversation. It was clear that something wasn't right, but it wasn't until I found myself at the heart of the forest that I understood just how deeply wrong it was. The park's true nature began to reveal itself when I ventured deeper into the wilderness. The deeper you go, the more the forest seems to close in around you. Trees become taller, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocks out the light, casting the ground beneath into shadow. The air grows thick, heavy, and damp. You can hear the wind howling through the trees, but it feels as if the sound is coming from within the earth itself. The familiar sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, grow quiet, like the land is holding its breath. That eerie silence made my pulse quicken. It was unnatural, unnerving. And that's when I first felt the eyes watching me. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination. The forest can play tricks on your senses, the way shadows move and the way the wind plays with the branches. But the feeling never left. It was a slow, creeping sensation that seemed to grow stronger the further I moved into the woods. The trees around me twisted in strange shapes, their trunks bending at odd angles, their roots seeming to claw at the ground. The sensation was one of being watched, but by something not of this world. Something that knew me, something that wasn't pleased with my intrusion. And then I found it. A trail of broken branches led me to a clearing where the ground was disturbed. The air was still here, too still. My heart was pounding as I knelt down, inspecting the signs. It looked like a struggle, a person dragged across the forest floor, with patches of blood left in its wake. My breath caught in my throat when I saw a ranger's badge, torn and covered in grime, half buried in the dirt. My stomach churned. This was no simple wildlife attack. Something far more malevolent was at play here. The sight of that badge was the catalyst that set everything into motion. I could have turned back. I should have. But something in me, something primal, told me to keep going. I could feel the presence that had been stalking me all along, drawing closer. It was as if the forest itself was alive, not just the trees, but the earth, the wind, the very air. I was no longer just walking in the woods. I was treading on something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries. As I ventured further, I could feel the forest thickening around me, the trees growing denser and closer together. The trail was now unmistakable. Something had passed through here, and it wasn't human. The trees seemed to bend in unnatural ways, reaching out to me, pulling me deeper into their grasp. It was then that I understood. This wasn't just a remote section of the park. This was a place forgotten by time, a place untouched by man, and whatever ancient force inhabited it, it didn't want me there. But it wasn't just the land that was alive. There was something else, something far darker, something that fed off the land and the people who ventured too far. I could feel it now, a palpable sense of malice and rage. I wasn't alone in the Smoky Mountains. I had become part of its dark history, and there was no turning back. I couldn't escape. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, the forest closed in around me. It wasn't just the trees. It was the very ground beneath me, pulling me down, trapping me in a nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. The presence was growing stronger, more insistent. It wasn't just a thing of shadows anymore. It was real, and it was coming for me. And that's when I realized, in the deepest part of my soul, that the Smoky Mountains weren't just a place on a map. They were a living entity, and they were seeking revenge. It had been waiting for me to cross its threshold, and now I was trapped in its grasp. As the days passed, the forest grew more foreboding, the weight of the tension pressing on my every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes in the trees and the underbrush, silently observing my every move. The once familiar landscape now felt alien, like I had crossed some invisible line, stepping into a place that wasn't meant for humans. But I pressed on, telling myself that I was trained for this, that nothing in this forest could break me. But with each passing hour, I began to realize how wrong I was. I had been a forest ranger for years. My role, my identity, had always been tied to my knowledge of nature, its creatures, its rhythms, its dangers. But this was different. There was something about the Smoky Mountains, especially the deeper, less charted parts, that resisted explanation. Even as I stood on the edge of a forest path, scanning my surroundings, I couldn't help but feel the unshakable sense that I had no business being there. I was no longer an explorer of the wilds. I was an intruder, and the land was making that very clear. The first incident that rattled me to my core occurred the second night of my expedition. I had set up camp, and the usual sounds of the forest had been replaced with a chilling silence. Even the animals, so accustomed to the presence of rangers, seemed to have retreated into the shadows. I had tried to shrug it off, focusing on my fire and the warmth it provided against the evening chill. But soon I noticed something that froze me in place. A low, whispering wind began to stir the trees, but it wasn't just the wind. It was a voice, faint and almost inaudible at first, but it grew louder with each passing moment. It sounded like words, like a conversation happening just out of reach, something I couldn't quite understand. My heart raced. I knew better than to ignore the signs of danger. Rangers are taught to trust their instincts, and mine were screaming at me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Still, the whispering persisted, a low murmur that felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I had no choice but to follow it, against every instinct telling me to flee. I stumbled through the underbrush, the voices growing clearer as I ventured deeper into the woods. I couldn't understand the language, but I knew deep down that it was not human. The sound was foreign, ancient, as though the trees themselves were speaking, sharing secrets older than the park itself. I pushed on, desperate to uncover the source, but the deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest around me seemed to shift, like it was alive, changing its shape, moving in ways it shouldn't. The path I had followed had disappeared, leaving me in an endless maze of trees, some of which were twisted in unnatural shapes, their branches curling like claws toward the sky. I was lost. As the panic set in, I realized that the whispering had stopped. It was replaced by something far worse, a guttural growl, low and menacing, coming from behind me. I spun around, but again there was nothing. Only shadows, thicker now, swirling in the corners of my vision. My breath caught in my throat as I fumbled for my rifle, but it felt too late. The creature, whatever it was already too close. It was a presence in the air, a weight that pushed down on me, suffocating me with dread. My heart pounded in my chest, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, dark as the night itself, moved between the trees. It wasn't human nor animal. It was something else. A distortion, like the forest had taken form and given shape to something monstrous. The figure stood tall, its shape shifting as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Its eyes, glowing red, locked onto mine. It was as if it was aware of my every thought, every movement. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare, transfixed by the terror I felt flooding my body. The creature took a step forward, another. Its presence was suffocating, closing in on me. I raised my rifle, hands trembling, and fired. But the shot didn't make contact. The figure seemed to dissolve into the trees, its form dissipating like mist in the wind. I was left standing in the cold, my heart racing, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I stumbled back, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. What had once been familiar paths and landmarks were now unfamiliar, disorienting. I was walking in circles. The trees, those gnarled, twisted things, seemed to mock me. The forest wasn't just big. It was alive, and it had a mind of its own. I spent hours wandering, completely disoriented. The darkness enveloped me, but no matter how far I went, there was no escape. It was as if the forest was controlling me, dragging me deeper into its heart. The growls and whispers began again, louder now, as if the land itself was trying to speak, trying to force me to understand something that I wasn't meant to. And then I realized it. I had crossed into something far more dangerous than a mere natural wilderness. I had ventured into the domain of something ancient, something that had been waiting for centuries for an intruder like me. The Smoky Mountains weren't just a place. They were a living, breathing entity, a force that knew no mercy. The forest was alive with vengeance, and I had become its prey. At that moment, I understood the whispers. They were warnings. I should have listened. The deeper I ventured into the Smoky Mountains, the more I realized that this forest was not just a wilderness of trees, rocks, and wildlife. It was something more. I had come to this place hoping to conquer it, to understand its mysteries, but the truth was far more insidious. There were layers to this place, layers of history, secrets, and forces that I was not prepared to face. As I walked further, I began to sense that there were things at play here, forces much older than myself, and they were not happy to see me. One of the first signs came when I thought I saw something moving in the shadows just beyond my vision. At first, I chalked it up to the play of light and darkness, a trick of the mind in a dense forest. But after several instances, I started to wonder whether I was truly alone. This was not a place where humans were welcome. I'd heard rumors of strange happenings before, mysterious disappearances, unexplained sounds, and most disturbingly, sightings of people or figures in the woods that never seemed to be quite right. There were stories, of course, and I, a seasoned ranger, had always dismissed them as mere campfire tales, until now. There was a moment when I discovered a small abandoned cabin deep within the forest. It was dilapidated, its wooden beams rotting and cracked, but something about it called to me. Perhaps it was my curiosity, or perhaps it was the overwhelming feeling that this place, this cabin, held answers to questions I hadn't even thought to ask. But as I approached it, I noticed something odd. The windows, though shattered, had an unnatural gleam to them. The door, hanging by a single rusty hinge, creaked with a sinister resonance as if it were welcoming me in, but also warning me to stay away. I shouldn't have entered, but I did. Inside, the walls were covered with markings, scratches, symbols, and strange drawings that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Some were familiar, others incomprehensible. My head spun with the effort to understand them, but the more I studied them, the more I felt a chill run through me. I found a journal, yellowed with age, crammed between a rotting floorboard and the wall. It belonged to someone named Elijah Harrow, a ranger from long ago, his notes filled with ramblings of strange happenings in the forest, of shadows that weren't shadows, of figures that didn't belong, and of a presence that haunted the trees. The journal told of a darkness that had once been sealed within the forest, something ancient and forgotten, but it had started to awaken. Elijah's last entry was hastily written and barely legible. The handwriting trembled as if in fear. "They are watching me. They know I'm here. They won't let me leave. If you find this, don't follow the path. The forest is their home, not ours." I couldn't get the journal out of my mind. I knew there was something I was missing, something key to understanding the terror that had started to creep into the forest. I found myself plagued by nightmares, where I would hear whispers and see shadowy figures just at the edge of my vision. The strange happenings, the growls, the whispers, it all started to make sense, but I knew that uncovering the truth was going to come at a terrible cost. Still, I had no choice but to press forward. One evening, as I trekked deeper into the forest, I noticed something even stranger. I could no longer see the sun through the canopy above. The trees were taller now, twisted, their limbs reaching out like skeletal arms. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the forest itself were closing in around me. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of wildlife anymore, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds. There was nothing but silence. It was unnerving. And then, I saw the signs of something that shouldn't have been there. There were footprints, large, humanoid, but unnatural. The kind of tracks that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. They led deeper into the forest, further away from the trail that I had been following. Despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I found myself following them, drawn as if by some invisible force. The prints seemed to lead me into the heart of the mountain, where the very air felt colder, as if the world itself had shifted in some unnatural way. This was where I realized that the forest wasn't just an entity. It was a place of power, a place that carried something ancient, something that had always been there, watching over the land, waiting for the right moment to reclaim it. The park, the mountains, it wasn't just a natural reserve, it was a prison. A prison for something that had been contained for centuries, its hunger growing, its thirst for vengeance never truly quenched. I wasn't just walking into danger, I was walking into the very heart of its power. The trees weren't just trees. The forest wasn't just forest. It was a living, breathing entity, something that had been waiting for the right time to strike, to punish the intruders who dared to trespass into its domain. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to distort. The ground beneath me became soft, almost marshy, as if the land was alive and shifting with every step I took. Shadows crept along the edges of my vision, twisting and turning as if they were moving of their own accord. And then I saw it, something large, something massive, watching me from the shadows of the trees. It wasn't a creature. Not really. It was a presence, something older than time itself, as if the land had absorbed the pain, the suffering, and the anger of all those who had come before me, all the rangers who had entered the forest, only to vanish without a trace. And now it was my turn. The forest was claiming me. I felt my heartbeat quicken as I tried to back away, but the shadows grew thicker, the air more oppressive, and the growls returned, this time louder, angrier. It was too late. There was no escape. I had been walking for what felt like hours, each step heavy and slow, weighed down by an overwhelming sense of dread. The forest around me had grown unnaturally silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breath and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became, as if the weight of the forest was bearing down on me, suffocating me. The trees, twisted and gnarled, loomed overhead like silent watchers, their branches clawing at the sky. It was then that I noticed it, the unnatural stillness in the air, the absence of any familiar sounds, even the usual hum of insects. It was as though the world around me had been muted, as if some force was controlling every aspect of the forest's existence. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart racing. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I saw it, a figure. It was barely a shadow, an outline in the corner of my eye. I quickly turned my head, but there was nothing there. My pulse quickened. This was no normal sighting. I had been a ranger for years, and I had encountered countless wildlife, even the occasional cryptid rumor, but this was different. This wasn't an animal. It wasn't even a human. It was something else, something wrong. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just the stress of being in this forsaken place, but the feeling lingered. My instincts were on edge, my training screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to continue forward, to press deeper into the heart of the mountain. The shadows grew thicker, and I could feel the temperature drop, the chill creeping into my bones. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it was no use. The cold wasn't just the weather, it was something else. It was as though the very land itself had turned against me, draining the warmth from my body. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized how isolated I was. I had no cell service. I couldn't even hear the sound of the wind anymore. Then a whisper, a voice, so faint I almost didn't hear it at first. It wasn't a voice I recognized, nor was it the voice of the forest's usual wildlife. It was something deeper, more ancient. The whisper seemed to echo around me, carrying a weight of malice, a presence that I could not escape. Leave now. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, but I was still alone. At least there was no one visible. But the forest itself felt alive, as if the trees, the earth, and the very air were speaking to me. A sudden gust of wind blew through the trees, bending them unnaturally, making the branches creak like bones. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee, but the path ahead of me seemed to draw me forward, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the reach of my senses, had become unbearable. I took a few steps forward, my feet moving of their own accord, until I came upon something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a clearing, unnatural in its symmetry. The trees around it were bent in a perfect circle, as if they had been shaped by some unseen force. In the center of the clearing, there was a large stone, a monolith of sorts, covered in moss and strange, indecipherable symbols. They looked almost like runes, but unlike anything I had ever seen before. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached it. The air around the stone seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. It was clear that this place was significant, but the feeling of unease only deepened. As I reached out to touch the stone, the ground beneath me rumbled. It was a low, guttural sound, like a growl rising from the depths of the earth. My fingers brushed against the stone, and a sudden wave of energy surged through me, cold and powerful, as if the very land itself were trying to reject me. And then I heard it again, the whisper. This time it was louder, more urgent. Leave now or suffer. I yanked my hand back, but the damage had already been done. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees creaking and groaning, as if they were alive. The air thickened, and a heavy fog began to roll in, shrouding everything in a suffocating mist. I spun around, my eyes darting in all directions, but there was no escape. The forest had closed in around me. The whispers grew louder, and the ground seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't comprehend. The temperature dropped further, and my breath came in ragged gasps as panic set in. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the mist, its shape barely visible at first. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending and twisting as it moved. The figure was not human. Its features were blurred, like a distorted reflection in water, but I could sense its malice, its hunger. It was a creature of the forest. No, it was the forest itself, taking form to punish me for trespassing. "Leave now." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a roar, a guttural growl that seemed to come from all around me. The creature reached out with long, skeletal arms, and I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet. It was closing in, and I knew then that there was no escaping it. The forest had claimed me. I turned and ran, the figure's presence behind me growing stronger, the whispers filling my ears. My heart raced, my legs aching as I pushed myself faster through the thickening fog. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling of being hunted. I stumbled over roots, my breath ragged, and I could feel the pull of the forest behind me, dragging me back into its grasp. The forest had spoken. I had trespassed, and now there was no turning back. The consequences were already set in motion, and the hunt had begun. As I sprinted through the dense fog, my legs burned with exhaustion, and my lungs screamed for air. My mind raced, but all I could focus on was the overwhelming sense of impending doom. The figure, the creature from the depths of the forest, was still behind me, its eerie whispers echoing in my ears, growing louder and more frantic as I ran. No matter how fast I pushed myself, it was always there, just beyond my reach, as if the very ground beneath me was conspiring to keep me within its grasp. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder of my failure to heed the warnings. I had been a guardian of the forest for years, trained to understand its rhythms and its dangers, yet I had been blind to the true threat that lay beneath the surface of the land I once thought I knew. I had made the mistake of thinking the forest was just a place, a physical space to be explored. But the mountains of the Smoky Park, the very land I had sworn to protect, were more than that. They were alive, in ways I had never comprehended, with a hunger that could not be satisfied. The weight of the realization hit me as I stumbled, my foot catching on a root hidden by the mist. I fell to the ground, pain shooting up my leg, but I didn't have the luxury of stopping. I gritted my teeth and pushed myself up, ignoring the blood that began to seep through my torn pants. But the consequences were already catching up with me. The forest seemed to tighten around me, as if mocking my futile attempts to escape. It wasn't just the creature that haunted me, it was the overwhelming power of the land itself. The trees, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to be closing in, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, their leaves whispering threats I could no longer ignore. I could feel the earth beneath me shifting, twisting in unnatural ways. The ground itself seemed to be rebelling against me, dragging me deeper into its grasp with every step I took. The forest wanted me, needed me, and it would stop at nothing to reclaim what it felt was rightfully its own. But it wasn't just physical, it was psychological. I could feel my sense of self slipping away, piece by piece, as the whispers grew louder. They were no longer just voices in the wind. They were inside my head, clawing at my thoughts, twisting my perception of reality. The forest was trying to break me, to consume me from the inside out. It made me question everything I had ever believed, every decision I had ever made. It wanted to break me, to show me the true cost of my actions. In the midst of my panic, memories began to surface, memories of my wife, the one person I had cared about more than anything. I remembered her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at me. But now those memories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The forest was erasing them, bit by bit. It was erasing me. I wasn't just being hunted by the creature anymore. I was being hunted by my own mind, by the fear and guilt that now consumed me. The mistakes I had made, the reckless curiosity, the betrayal of my own instincts, my pride in thinking I could control the forest, were now suffocating me. Every step I took felt like an admission of guilt, like I was dragging my own soul through the mud. And the worst part, I had no idea if I would ever make it out of the forest alive, or if I would ever escape this torment. But I could feel it now. The thing that had been holding me back, the thing that had been keeping me from truly understanding the forest, was slipping away. In my desperation, I started to hear something different within the whispers. It wasn't just fear anymore. There was something else, something that had been with me all along. Anger. The forest was angry. Angry at me for thinking I could control it, for stepping into its sacred space without understanding its power. It wasn't just trying to scare me. It was punishing me for my arrogance, for thinking I could dominate it. The realization was like a slap to the face. I wasn't the one in control here. I was nothing more than a trespasser, an intruder in a world that didn't belong to me. The creature, its distorted form still lurking in the fog, its malicious whispers ringing in my ears, was the manifestation of that anger. It wasn't some random cryptid. It was the forest itself, taking shape to exact its revenge. It was the embodiment of the land's will, its fury made flesh, and I was its target. I had no choice but to run, to push myself harder, faster, despite my aching body, despite the sense of impending collapse. The fog thickened, the darkness closing in as if the forest was swallowing the world around me. I had no destination, no clear path to follow. All I could do was run, driven by the primal need to survive. But with every step I took, I could feel the forest tightening around me, its grip on my soul becoming stronger. The consequences of my actions, of my arrogance and my ignorance, had come to claim me, and there was no escape. I realized then that the forest didn't just want me to leave, it wanted me to understand. It wanted me to know that its power could never be controlled, that no human, no matter how skilled, could ever hope to dominate it. The forest was not a place to be conquered. It was a place to be respected, a living, breathing entity that demanded reverence, not exploration. And now, I was paying the price for my lack of respect. The question now wasn't whether I could escape. It was whether I would survive long enough to ever see the world beyond the Smoky Mountains again. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been minutes, hours, or maybe days. The only thing I knew for certain was that the world around me had changed completely. The once familiar sounds of the forest, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves in the wind, had disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against my ears like a physical weight. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. And that something was me. I had spent years as a forest ranger in the Smoky Mountains, dedicating myself to preserving and understanding the wild places of the world. But all of that training, all of those years of experience, suddenly felt useless in the face of what I was facing. This was no ordinary forest. This was a place of ancient power, a living, breathing entity that was as old as the earth itself. And it didn't care about my expertise. The forest had its own rules, its own laws, and I had broken them. I had made the fatal mistake of thinking I could control it, that I could wander into its heart, uninvited, and come away unscathed. But the forest had responded with vengeance, and now I was trapped, not just in the physical landscape, but in my own mind, my own doubts and fears. The creature, the whispers, the relentless pressure from the land itself, all of it was feeding off my guilt, my fear. It was as if the forest had found my weakest point and was using it to break me down piece by piece. But there was a part of me deep down that refused to let go. There was a spark, a glimmer of defiance that refused to be extinguished. I wasn't going to die here, not like this. I wasn't going to let the forest have me without a fight. The realization hit me like a wave. This was the moment. I had to confront the creature, confront whatever force was pulling the strings behind all of this, and fight back. It wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a battle for my own sanity, my own soul. The forest was trying to break me, to twist my mind, to make me into something I wasn't. It was trying to erase everything that made me who I was. But I wasn't going to let it win. I was a part of this forest as much as it was a part of me. I had lived with its beauty and its dangers, and I wasn't going to let it consume me now. The whispers grew louder again, more insistent. But this time, instead of retreating, I leaned into them. I focused on the voices that once terrified me. They were telling me something. They were trying to lead me somewhere I needed to be. I couldn't keep running from them. I had to face them head on. I pushed myself forward, ignoring the exhaustion, the pain that still throbbed in my legs from the injury I'd sustained earlier. The fog seemed to close in around me, but this time I didn't care. I was ready. I had learned something in the darkness of the forest that I hadn't realized before. The forest, in all its rage and fury, was not just something to fear. It was something to understand. It was a force of nature, yes, but it was also a reflection of me, my thoughts, my emotions, my very essence. The whispers were no longer frightening. They were the echoes of my own inner turmoil, my own doubts and regrets. I could hear my fears, my guilt, and my desires intertwined with the voices of the forest. It was as if the forest itself was reflecting everything I had tried to bury, everything I had tried to escape. And that realization was the key to my survival. I stopped running, and for the first time since I had entered this cursed place, I stood still. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I could feel the presence of the creature, the darkness that loomed in the shadows, but I no longer feared it. I didn't need to fight it. I needed to embrace it, to accept it as part of the whole. The forest was me, and I was the forest. I reached out with my senses, feeling the pulse of the land beneath me, the heartbeat of the trees, the whisper of the wind. I understood now that this wasn't just a physical battle. It was spiritual. I wasn't just trying to escape the forest. I was trying to reconcile with it. The creature wasn't something that needed to be destroyed. It was a part of the forest's will, its embodiment of the rage and fear I had been carrying with me for so long. And so I stood there, not fighting, but listening, letting the whispers wash over me. I embraced my guilt, my regret, my fears, and allowed them to dissolve into the landscape. I let go of the need to control, to dominate. Instead, I allowed myself to become one with the forest, to accept its power and its beauty, its darkness and its light. I wasn't just a visitor here. I was a part of this place, as much as the trees, the animals, and the winds. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel the weight of the fog lifting. The whispers faded, no longer malicious but calm, almost soothing. The forest had tested me, had shown me the depths of my own darkness, but in doing so, it had also shown me the way forward. I wasn't the same man who had entered these woods. I was changed, and perhaps that was the point all along. I took one last look at the shadows that had once hunted me, and to my surprise, they no longer seemed threatening. The forest had given me the power to understand it, to stand as its equal, not as its adversary. The creature that had haunted me, that had tormented me, was no longer an enemy. It was a guardian, a reminder that I was a part of something much larger than myself. And as I turned and made my way out of the forest, I understood that my battle was not over. There were more lessons to learn, more truths to uncover. But for the first time in what felt like forever, I was no longer afraid. The forest had won, not by breaking me, but by showing me who I truly was. And I had learned to accept that. I was free. As I continued my journey deeper into the Smoky Mountains, the forest grew more oppressive. The trees, once majestic and comforting, now felt like towering sentinels that watched every move I made. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, and it seemed as though even the wind itself had been silenced. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, though I couldn't pinpoint what was after me. The path, which had been somewhat clear when I first began, was now overgrown with tangled roots and vines, forcing me to climb over and push through the dense underbrush. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The world around me seemed to blur as my senses sharpened. Every snap of a twig or rustling leaf seemed amplified, and my heart began to race with every step. My body was exhausted, my limbs aching, but I couldn't stop now. I was too close to whatever was waiting for me, too far down this rabbit hole to turn back. I couldn't help but think of the warnings I'd heard, stories of rangers who had gone into the depths of these mountains and never returned. Tales of strange creatures, whispering shadows, and cursed lands. I had always brushed them off, thinking them to be nothing more than campfire tales to scare off the unprepared. But now, with each step I took, I began to wonder if there was some truth to those stories. The forest seemed alive with malevolent energy, as if the trees themselves held memories of the horrors that had occurred within their roots. It was then that I heard it, the low growl, almost imperceptible, yet enough to send a chill down my spine. It was close, much closer than I had expected. The sound wasn't coming from a bear or any other creature I could recognize. This was something different, something darker. My pulse quickened, and instinctively, I reached for the rifle slung over my shoulder, my fingers trembling as they gripped the cold metal. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't deny it any longer. The stories weren't just stories. There was something out there, something that had been waiting for me, something that knew I had come for it. With every passing minute, the tension in the air grew. The dense fog that had been swirling around me seemed to thicken, wrapping itself around the trees, blurring my vision and obscuring the way ahead. I could still hear the growl, low and rumbling, but now it seemed to be accompanied by something else. The rustling of leaves, the creak of branches bending unnaturally, the whisper of something moving in the shadows. The forest, it seemed, was alive with danger, and every movement I made brought me closer to whatever nightmare lurked just out of sight. I knew that I was on the edge now, teetering between the world of the living and something far darker. The deeper I went, the closer I came to confronting whatever had been pulling the strings behind the strange events in these mountains. But with each step, the fear gnawed at me, fear of the unknown, fear of what waited just beyond my reach. It wasn't just the physical dangers of the forest that weighed on me, but the psychological toll it was taking. My mind was starting to unravel, the lines between reality and delusion blurring. I began to see things, shapes darting in and out of the fog, eyes that glinted in the darkness, and shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Were these creatures of the forest? Or was it the strain of isolation and fear playing tricks on my mind? I couldn't tell anymore. Still, I pressed forward. It was my duty to protect this land, to uncover the truth about the mysterious happenings that had plagued these mountains for so long. I couldn't leave without answers. The whispers I had heard earlier, those faint, chilling voices, still echoed in my mind. They weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real, and they had a purpose. But I didn't know what that purpose was yet. The growl was louder now, unmistakable, and it sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. Something was closing in on me. I could feel it in the very air around me, thick with tension. I could almost taste it, like the metallic tang of blood hanging in the atmosphere. The creature, or whatever it was moving closer, and I was no longer in control. The forest had swallowed me whole, and now there was no turning back. I stopped, listening. The growl had stopped as well, and all was silent once more. The eerie calm before the storm. It was in that silence that I realized the true horror of my situation. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The men I had come with, the rangers who had ventured into these woods before me, they were either dead or disappeared, and no one knew what had happened to them. I was nothing more than a lone soul in a forest that had no mercy. The creature, whatever it was, knew this. It knew my fear, my vulnerability. It knew I was running out of time. But I wasn't going to give up. I wasn't going to let it win. I took a deep breath, forcing my mind to focus. I could feel the weight of the rifle in my hands, its cold, solid presence grounding me. I couldn't let the fear take control. I had to survive. I had to make it out of here. The fog parted slightly ahead, revealing a dark shape in the distance. The creature, or whatever it was standing just beyond the trees, watching me. Its presence was palpable, the air around it thick with malevolent energy. I knew I was nearing the end, nearing the final confrontation that would determine my fate. I had come this far. There was no turning back now. The creature was waiting for me, and I was ready. It was time to face whatever had been hunting me in the shadows. It was time to confront the darkness. The creature's shape emerged more clearly from the fog. My heart thudded in my chest as I gripped my rifle tightly, my fingers stiff with fear and adrenaline. My breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. What was it? A bear? Some kind of wild animal? Or was it something far worse, something beyond the realm of what I could comprehend? It wasn't human, that much was clear. Its form was dark, towering over the trees with limbs that seemed too long, too thin, bending in unnatural angles. Its eyes, gleaming yellow like pools of molten gold, burned with an intelligence far too sharp for any beast of the wild. It watched me, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as though the creature itself bent reality, warping the very space between us. My pulse hammered in my ears. My mind screamed at me to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen. Staring into those eyes, I could feel the creature's presence in my bones, as if it were digging into my very soul, pulling out all my darkest fears and regrets. It knew me, knew everything about me. The moment I stepped into this forest, I had walked into its territory, and now it was here to collect. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of panic that clouded my mind. I had to act. This was no time for hesitation. I could feel my body trembling, my muscles tight with fear, but I steadied my aim, focusing on the creature's chest. If I didn't take the shot, I would die. I would become another forgotten soul swallowed by the mountain, lost to its cursed wilderness. The creature let out a guttural growl, more like a low, rumbling hum that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it were savoring the moment. The fog parted slightly around it, revealing more of its grotesque form. It had a face, if you could call it that, covered in dark, matted fur, but its mouth was not like anything I had seen before. Jagged teeth filled its maw, curved and broken, as though it had been designed to tear apart anything that dared come near. I could feel its hunger, its desire for something deeper than a simple meal. This was not just an animal, it was something ancient, something bound to the land itself, its very existence tied to the forest in ways that made my skin crawl. The creature was no mere cryptid, it was a guardian, a predator, a force of nature. It took a step forward, and I squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the forest, but the creature didn't flinch. The bullet didn't even seem to pierce its skin, as if the very air around it was rejecting my attempt to harm it. The rifle jolted in my hands, the recoil forcing me back a step, but the creature didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, unfazed by the attack. I cursed under my breath, panic beginning to surge again. My mind raced. Why hadn't it worked? This thing was supposed to be a physical entity, something that could be killed. But it wasn't. It was something far older, far stronger than I had ever imagined. The legends had spoken of cryptids and creatures of the mountain, but I hadn't truly believed. Not until now. I backed away, moving slowly, trying not to show fear. The creature watched me, its eyes burning into my every move. But I was not about to run. Not again. I would not become one of its victims. I needed to think. I had to outsmart it. There had to be something I could do. My mind flashed back to the research I had done before coming here. The strange disappearances, the stories about the forest's power, the cryptids that no one could track. And then it hit me. This was not just a creature of flesh and bone. It was something tied to the land itself, something connected to the ancient energy of the forest. Suddenly I understood. The mountains, the fog, the shadows, all of it was part of its power. The creature was not just a predator. It was the embodiment of the land itself, a guardian of the forest's secrets. I wasn't going to win by fighting it directly. The only chance I had was to outwit it, to use its connection to the forest against it. But how? My eyes darted around, searching for anything I could use. And then, in the distance, I saw it. An ancient tree, its gnarled roots protruding from the earth like the fingers of a long-dead giant. It was the largest tree I had ever seen, and it was standing at the center of the clearing. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the tree, ignoring the creature's growl as it followed. I could hear it moving, crashing through the underbrush behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew that if I stopped, it would be the end of me. Reaching the tree, I pressed myself against its rough bark, feeling the ancient energy pulsing through it. The creature was getting closer, its presence suffocating, but I could sense something now, something that hadn't been there before. The land itself seemed to shift around me, reacting to the creature's presence. I placed my hand on the bark, my fingers trembling, and then I did something I never thought I would do. I called to the forest. In that moment, I let go of my fear. I called upon the ancient power of the mountains, the energy that had shaped this land long before mankind ever set foot here. I knew that the creature was not just a guardian. It was a part of something much greater. It was connected to the land itself, and if I could reach that power, I might just have a chance. The ground trembled. The air crackled with energy. The creature roared in fury, but it was too late. The forest had answered. The fog thickened, the trees swayed, and the land itself seemed to rise up against the creature. The darkness that surrounded it began to recede, and for the first time since I had entered this cursed place, I felt a flicker of hope. But I knew the battle was far from over. The creature screeched, its form twisting and distorting as it was pulled back into the shadows of the forest, as if the very earth was reclaiming it. I didn't have much time. I had awakened something that had been lying dormant for centuries, and it wasn't done with me yet. But for now, I had survived, and I had one chance to make it out of these mountains alive. As I stood there, with my back pressed against the ancient tree and my heart still racing, the weight of what had just happened settled over me. The creature, whatever it was, had been driven back, but the forest was far from finished with me. The land itself, alive with energy, had responded to my desperate call. I had stirred something within the mountains, something older and more powerful than I could ever fully understand. I had come to the park to seek out answers, driven by curiosity and the strange rumors that whispered about this cursed place. I thought I could handle it, that I could outsmart the dangers of the wild. But I was wrong. The mountains, the fog, the creatures lurking within, they were not simply things to be conquered. They were forces of nature, ancient and unforgiving, and I was a mere intruder in their domain. As I turned to leave, every step I took felt like I was walking on a razor's edge. The forest seemed to watch me, its eyes hidden in the shadows. I had survived this encounter, but I knew that I would never be the same again. The creature's presence, its eyes, would haunt me for the rest of my days. The feeling of being so small and insignificant in the face of something so vast and ancient would never leave my mind. I had to leave, but I also knew that the forest would never truly let me go. It had marked me, and its grip was something that couldn't be shaken off so easily. It wasn't just the cryptid or the fog I had to fear now. It was the power of the land itself. The mountains, the trees, the creatures, everything in that cursed place had its own purpose, its own will. And I had dared to disturb it. When I finally made it to the edge of the park, I collapsed to the ground, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I had no idea what had truly happened, or why the creature had let me go. Maybe it was the forest's will, or maybe I had simply been fortunate. Either way, I knew that the danger wasn't over. There were more secrets hidden within the mountains, things that the world was never meant to know. And I had only scratched the surface. The journey back to civilization was long and silent. I didn't speak to anyone. I couldn't. How could I explain what I had seen? What I had felt? No one would believe me. The memories of the creature's eyes, the pulse of energy from the trees, and the oppressive presence of the forest would be mine to carry alone. But one thing was certain: I would never return to the mountains. The park, with its quiet beauty and hidden dangers, would always remain a haunting reminder of my own hubris. I had been naive to think I could walk away unscathed. The mountains had changed me, broken something inside me that could never be fixed. In the end, I had learned that some places should remain untouched, some forces should not be provoked. The forest had its own power, its own rules, and those who dared challenge them would always pay the price. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last, but I was one of the few who had walked away with my life. And I would never be the same. Years have passed since I left the park, but the memories still linger, like shadows in the corners of my mind. I rarely speak of what happened in the mountains, and when I do, the words feel like a lie, too unbelievable to share. The world continues on, unaware of the dangers hidden within those ancient trees. As for me, I've become a recluse, haunted by the knowledge that something still watches, waiting. The forest's grip may have loosened, but it never truly let me go. And I know deep down it will call me back, whether I want it or not. If you ever find yourself drawn to the wild, to places untouched by time, remember this: some things are best left undiscovered. The forests may seem peaceful, the mountains inviting, but there are forces in nature that we are not meant to understand. If you're curious, let that curiosity stay in your mind and not in your steps. The world has enough mysteries without us disturbing them. If you hear whispers on the wind or see shadows where there should be none, turn back. The danger is real, and you don't want to find out just how real it is.